Now, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. We have a very exciting session for you today. We are looking at our CoverageBook's benchmarks report, which we have literally released in the last few hours. So for those of you who don't know, back in 2020, we did a benchmarking report where we looked at the URLs submitted to CoverageBook to try and determine, I guess, what is a good piece of coverage, like how many shares is good. And I know loads of you liked that data and use it a lot, because I know I've been asked numerous occasions to do it again. But it is a lot of work, which is why I'm even more thrilled to be joined by Steph Bridgeman. So Steph has analysed over 6 million URLs that have been added to CoverageBook over the last year. For those of you who don't know Steph, we've worked with Steph a few times before. She's the founder of Experienced Media Analysis. She has over 25 years of PR measurement experience. I've given away your age there. You're over 25. She's a founder of AMEC, so she's helping form how the industry is measuring PR, and Steph has won a gazillion PR awards, whether they're for her own agency or helping others write theirs. And last but not least, Steph is an all-round good egg and always fun to listen to. So Steph has been helping us this year look at all the URLs that have been submitted to CoverageBook, so that you can start to have a gauge about what a good piece of coverage looks like. Jennifer says you are a good egg. Brilliant. And yeah, please do use the chat to say hi and chat as you go along. Feel free to ask questions. We'll try and answer them as we go through. And what we'll do as well, just to save your fingers, if you are registered for this, I will give you a follow-up email, which will have a link to the actual report. It will have a recording of this session along with Steph's slides. Steph has also written a fantastic blog post to go alongside the benchmark report with even more analysis. So have a look at that as well, because it also contains some good tips on sort of how you can use this data within your own reports and benchmark your own PR coverage. I think that's it from me for now, because I'm going to hand over to Steph to give you the juicy bits of the report. Is there anything else you think I should say, Steph, before I hand over?
No, I think you might have said I was a founder at AMEC, but I'm only a board director at AMEC.
No, I meant to say board director, and then say sorry, no, founder at Experienced Media Analysis and a board member at AMEC. Thank you.
Cheers, Laura. No, really exciting to be here. Thanks for inviting me, and it's lovely to see some friends already in the chat there. So really good to see you. We've called it CoverageBook Benchmarks 2025 just because we are now in 2025, but in reality, the data is based on some number crunching on 6 million URLs, let's call it, that were submitted to CoverageBook system in 2024. And what is amazing is when you can look at data in a big scale like that. Firstly, I want to reassure you it's anonymized data. We have no idea who submitted the data or anything like that, but we were looking at the data that was in the public domain. So things like the URL, from the URL, we can tell some really interesting things as to perhaps, which segment of the website a piece of coverage was in, for example. Other pieces of information around domain authority, which is a good guide as to how beneficial that can be in terms of search engine optimization and how likely it is for that content to be seen and crawled by search engines such as Google. And then looking at things like social shares. And it's just such a common question I get asked when I'm working with clients and reporting on the success of their media coverage, particularly if you're looking at a piece-by-piece basis. What does good look like? Is 100 shares in the Daily Mail good? Is 25 shares on Reuters good? All that kind of stuff. So we did some really broad number crunching. We're going to kind of look at the broad stuff to begin with. And then I just in time for today's session, I have put some deeper dive information at a publication level for some key publications, some key UK and US publications to start with. And much of that sort of later detail around the publications will be coming in a future blog post that I'll be working on and will be posting on the CoverageBook website, hopefully in the next couple of weeks too. So keep looking out for updates in relation to that. Okay, yeah, so what does, why does benchmarking matter? I think people really like to compare themselves against the competition. Whenever I work with clients, it's always the competitive stuff that gets the most attention. Often, for example, if you're looking at things like share of voice against competitors, for example, it's that pie chart and how successful you've been against competition on certain metrics are really the things that get executives particularly fired up. So to be able to compare your performance and your average domain authority scores and your average volume of social shares for a particular piece of work or a campaign, and then compare it against everybody else that's been submitting their content to CoverageBook is a really interesting thing. You've got to bear in mind, of course, is that is the caveat, is that this is based on coverage that has been submitted to CoverageBook. So I probably take from that it's probably good coverage. It's probably coverage that may have been proactively generated by an organisation, by a PR agency. So just do bear that in mind. We haven't looked across the board at all output, for example, from the Daily Mail or all output from websites such as Forbes, but just specifically what has been submitted by all of the customers at CoverageBook into its system. And one of the first things I think is always really interesting is to consider domain authority. So for anybody that doesn't yet know what domain authority is or wants a little reminder, it's a 100-point scale, 100 being the best, 0 being the worst. Sites such as Daily Mail, for example, I think it has a domain authority score of 94 or 96. Those kind of national, international titles will have a domain authority in the broad range of the 90s. Sort of trade-specific publications will be based on, will typically give you a domain authority sometimes in the sort of 40s, 50s, and 60s, and so on. And so we looked at specifically for this 5 million pieces of content with a good domain authority showing, and we were able to see the extent to which content with a domain authority, for example, between 90 and 100, that was prevalent within the content that was being submitted to CoverageBook. And from that, we were able to demonstrate that, for example, if you're managing to get an average domain authority between 90 and 100, that is quite impressive. But we are seeing that a lot more of CoverageBook's customers are actually getting that kind of content. That's as a result of probably focusing on high impact titles that reach a lot of people, that achieve the good outcomes for organizations as well. And we did see a massive increase compared to that piece of work that happened in 2020, where I think it was just 1.5% of CoverageBook's customers were achieving that kind of content. Again, you have to bear in mind that this is reflective of the customer base at CoverageBook too. You've always got to consider the limitations of the data that we're putting in to show these benchmarks. But if, for example, you're achieving across your campaigns an average domain authority of, let's say, 53, that would place you in the top 61% of CoverageBook's customers that are achieving that kind of content. Specifically, 13% of all the content that we were analysed had a domain authority between, say, 50 and 59. And also what's really interesting is to consider who or how many people are engaging with content. And I think that's quite an important metric too. The reason I like to focus on social shares, particularly as a metric, is that it demonstrates that content has had an impact, has been seen, but has resonated enough for an audience participant to share it with on their social channels with their audiences too. It's a way in which your audiences can help amplify the media coverage. But actually, it's interesting to note that nearly well, 2/3, it's 66.66% of content does not receive any shares whatsoever. So it's okay to receive coverage and see no evidence of any social shares. That actually places you in the majority of people. What we then did is we put that those ranges of social shares into broad buckets between 1 and 100 shares. We put those buckets in sort of smaller gaps of tens, and then we went up into those areas where you're perhaps receiving much higher numbers of social shares, perhaps in the hundreds, sometimes even in the thousands. We did actually see an increase in the percentage of CoverageBook's customers that were receiving significantly high numbers of social shares, social shares above, let's say, 1,000. And some of that is in relation to the kind of content that is being uploaded to the system. We're seeing a lot more people uploading, for example, this is social shares both of earned news, but actually demonstrative of people sharing social media posts as well. And so as we're seeing more people uploading Instagram coverage, for example, TikTok mentions and so on, that is the kind of coverage that is receiving a lot higher level of engagement. And that's why we see, for example, 1.68% of the results had shares above 1,000, and that would place you in the top 2% of performance here. So yeah, as I say, the key thing to remember in terms of social shares is it's completely normal, and you're in the majority if you're not receiving any social shares whatsoever. And actually, it's just really quite normal to receive social shares in the low, the single figure digit numbers. So only 19% of coverage was shared 10 times or more. And I thought it was really interesting to sort of do that deeper dive, and because those past couple of slides there is looking at a really broad data set. We're looking at numbers there in the millions, but actually it's sometimes interesting to delve onto a specific publication level. And we know that CoverageBook has a lot of customers both here in the UK, where I'm speaking from, and over in the US as well. So we picked some kind of key titles that a lot of clients that I work with get content in. And actually, we could see from the data that these were amongst some of the most prolific news outlets that people were submitting their coverage from. And what we found, if we look at titles such as the New York Times, BBC, Daily Mail, I chose the Manchester Evening News, but that's because I'm based here in the northwest of England, and it's quite a big influential regional title here. But actually then looking at titles such as Bloomberg and Reuters, so your newswires, but those international titles such as Forbes, and interestingly also Yahoo and MSN, where we see a lot of volume of content being uploaded, but actually a very low level of average social shares per piece on those outlets such as Yahoo and MSN. And that's really interesting, I think, with the Yahoo and MSN observations in particular. These are sites actually that to a large extent syndicate and aggregate content from other sources. And it's something that I've always had in the back of my mind. Like, who actually really wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to go onto MSN and read some coverage? It's a different kind of, those two channels, I think, particularly, are sources that are sometimes embedded into a browser, but perhaps are not necessarily go-to websites that people go to specifically to seek out news content, and perhaps not really the kind of websites where content is being shared at a large scale. I just wanted to also put a caveat against these numbers that I'm showing you on the slides here, because they might change a little bit when we write the blog post in the next couple of weeks. And that's because I've put these publication level data together yesterday. I've done my own working, but you know what happens sort of a week after you've done your own work and you check your own figures. So I don't want you to take these average numbers as gospel. Wait until our blog post comes out in a couple of weeks, and hopefully the numbers won't change too much, but I just wanted to put that caveat out there. I think this is really interesting now. This is looking at the Daily Mail, and what's fascinating, Daily Mail is one of the most prolific sources that CoverageBook clients upload content onto. There were over 13,000 pieces uploaded from the Daily Mail. And even when you're just looking at a list of 13,000 pieces from the Daily Mail and the URL, you can make some interesting insights just by looking at the structure of the URL, because the bit that comes after the dailymail.com and then the / is indicative of the segment of the newspaper or the publication that it appears. And so it's clear that we can tell that you know, a lot of the content is being shared from the showbiz section. That's called the sidebar of shame. There's the news section, there's the female section, and so on and so forth. And we were able to work out what the average number of shares were per section. So this is not necessarily saying that we get a lot of content from the TV or showbiz section, but we're saying that this is where you get that you're most likely to receive the highest number of average engagements, is in the showbiz section, the news section, female section, and travel, and so on. There's also another area of the Daily Mail website that is actually quite hard to find, and it's something that I often am interested in when I see coverage being received from some of my clients from places like the Daily Mail. And it's this syndicated content from the newswire. So Daily Mail will run on its site, hidden deep in its site, not on the front page, not necessarily in the news section, definitely not on the sidebar of shame, but it will run syndicated content from newswires such as Reuters, Associated Press, and so on. And again, this is clearly visible from the URL structure. It will often say wires in the style of the URL. And I've always wondered whether anybody actually sees that coverage. And I think some of this evidence of no social shares amongst wire coverage is indicative perhaps of that coverage is there on its website, but perhaps is not getting the same kind of eyeballs and attention and engagement that this other parts of the Daily Mail website are getting. So I suppose my point I'm trying to make here on this slide is not every piece in the Daily Mail is considered equal. Some sections are better than others. Obviously, you're going to be targeting different sections based on the kind of client organization you're working for. But I think it's really fascinating that if you're aiming to attract engagement and potentially action, these are perhaps some of the areas that you might want to be focusing on in the different sections of the site. Then similarly onto Bloomberg. Again, if you work on a lot of corporate clients, perhaps working with particular sort of financial news or specific, you know, news around trading updates and so on, you might be targeting some of these news wires. And so on this page and the next page, we've got some information around Bloomberg. I thought this was really interesting. You're most likely to get engagement with Bloomberg if your content is featuring in the features segment. And that's, again, indicative in the URL structure. And we were seeing some particularly high engagement with some stories. We could tell what they were, again, just from the wording of the URL. So there was particular features, for example, luxury travel destinations. And those kind of pieces generate high volumes of social engagement. What's quite interesting, and we might talk about this a little bit later at the Q&A section, is that also some of these sites have, to a large extent, optimize some pieces or URLs to exist in an ongoing way. So what I mean by that is they kind of create like an evergreen URL is what I call it. So it could be best luxury travel destinations. And this is a URL that remains and probably gets promoted and optimized for search engine purposes, but actually the content within it changes based on new content being submitted by public relations agencies and brands and so on. And so we might sort of have an interesting conversation later on about sort of, you know, what we've observed about that over the years as we've seen content being submitted to CoverageBook and just sort of some of the things to watch out for when you're uploading these kind of evergreen URLs into your CoverageBook. What I also noticed in the Bloomberg analysis as well is that there was evidence of social sharing amongst this kind of type of content called newsletters. And Bloomberg, you can subscribe to specific newsletters focused on specific areas of performance. And of course, that's also an interesting development in itself, because not only is the content that appear in these newsletters evident and available for people who are going to visit the Bloomberg site, but of course this content is being delivered to people directly into their inbox as well. So sometimes newsletters can be an interesting area of focus, again, if you're trying to reach people in an engaged way, because it's a kind of push mechanism of getting content out to them, as well as being there in a way in which people can go out and seek it out. Similarly with Reuters, we could see that technology and sport related content and featuring in those particular segments of the Reuters site is most likely to receive social shares. Actually, some of that sports stuff was linked to 2024 Olympics coverage happening in the past year. And actually, we could see some kind of commonality in terms of the kind of technology-related stories that were receiving the highest volume of social shares, and bringing that average figure up across the board. There were stories related to AI and crypto. New York Times. Well, actually, New York Times has got loads and loads of segments. And on this particular chart here, I've shown the top 20 segments within the New York Times producing the most social engagement. So, you know, there's a list of about 50 different segments, I think, that we could have shown you on this chart, but you wouldn't have been able to see the bars very well. Of course, New York Times, it's a sort of big US title, but it has a segment in it related to the New York region. So in a sense, that's kind of the local news bit, I suppose, of the New York Times. And that's that's a segment of the website that receives the highest on average level of social engagement there. So interestingly, actually, obituary section appearing number 4 on that list as well. Perhaps a little bit of a morbid observation there, but technology less so in the New York Times. But again, what we notice here actually is that the average number of engagements in New York Times compared to some of the other titles we've seen on previous page, we're seeing some really good numbers here, high hundreds, in the thousands here. And actually, it's often the case when we compare some US titles versus UK titles. Of course, US, everything's bigger. Numbers are always bigger. Audiences are bigger. So it's just something to bear in mind there too. And then, apologies, I thought I had another slide, but that is the final slide in my presentation. So yeah, it's just really fascinating to see, just at the very broad level, how you're comparing against the competition on the big numbers, but then being able to delve into it on a really detailed level into the small numbers as well. I see that there have been some questions coming in as I've been speaking, but I've been focusing on this side of the screen to kind of keep my flow going. So perhaps I'll look a little bit now onto the right-hand side of the screen and see if we can approach any of the questions that may
I did start to answer them, and then I thought,
brilliant,
I was taking your fun away from you, so I stopped. As you have a read down, I actually feel like I know I've done webinars in the past about being comfortable on the smaller numbers, and this is just like really highlighted the fact I find the social shares really interesting. And like, if you have coverage that has been shared, even if the shares are minimal, it's some of the smaller numbers that you should really celebrate, and someone's done something with that piece of coverage, and now you can say, you know, it's not normal for it to be shared very much at all, so we should really celebrate that someone's shared it this many times. And I think, like, I really want to try and push this year for being more excited about the smaller numbers. I know you mentioned sort of like Yahoo and MSN, and they often get they've got the bigger overall audience, you know, the sites are big and the pages are big, so sometimes, you know, quite vanity metrics of like, oh, this is on this really, really big site, but to be actually saying like this piece of coverage has been shared this many times, people are doing it, and we're in the minority to do it, I think is the bit that quite excites me about this.
And that's why I think it's so exciting to have this context to be able to compare performance against, because yeah, otherwise it is hard to big up a single digit shares number. But
exactly, especially in context,
it
like a piece on MSN or Yahoo, which now like this data is showing might not, like in some cases, be seen that much, let alone shared, versus a smaller site. And I know we're hopefully looking into different sectors as well, hopefully coming up soon. And I think that might dig into this even more, I'm hoping. So I will, have you had a chance to choose which questions you're going to answer first? Or do you want me to pick some out for you?
I see, just checking, do social shares include Instagram? I think the answer is no to that.
Oh, no, you can put in the URLs include Instagram. So you can put.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. It does mean that. Could you give us an indication of coverage views and what is good? We can do that. I haven't got the data to hand, but we've got the data in aggregate at the back end. So we probably will be saying some more about that in the upcoming blog posts. For example, one of the things I can remember off the top of my head around Daily Mail, of course, is that an average piece on the Daily Mail, unless it's somewhere really big, like the homepage, for example, but your average piece on the Daily Mail is likely to have an estimated coverage views around about 300,000 ECV. So I really do see the value in, again, focusing on the small number rather than the big number. And I think that's one thing that CoverageBook has been so amazing at doing over 10 or so years that I've been supporting this particular brand, is trumpeting the value of the credible small number.
Yeah,
because credible small numbers are better than big numbers. And I'm sure we've all seen the CoverageBook advertising campaign that won awards. And I play frequently in workshops that I do. Actually, I use it as I love that particular advert because I use it as a breather in which I can take a sip of water, but it just makes everybody laugh. So again, focusing on the estimated coverage views number is going to be smaller, but it's a much more credible number than that site-wide audience figure.
I'm just going to flip back slightly because I might have confused everyone. The URLs that we look at include Instagram. The shares don't include shares on Instagram. I think that's where does that make sense? Hopefully it does. Are there any other ones you are? Thank you. Jennifer says that was interesting and brilliantly presented. I think we've probably got time for you to pick one more question.
Are there any giveaways, indicators when coverage is being scraped from a website rather than syndicated? Oh, well, if it's been syndicated, it's kind of normally obvious from the URL structure, I feel. If it's been scraped, that's a naughty behavior, isn't it? Because you're not doing it necessarily with the permission of the copyright owner. And so maybe they won't be as blatant as to make that clear in the URL structure. That's a really good question, and one that I would need to think about the answer for, actually. Sorry, I will admit I don't know the answer to that right now. Can you share how many brands were included to get to the 5.6 million URLs? It's an indication of no, because it's an indication of CoverageBook's customer base and so on and so forth, and that wasn't provided in the data that was sent over to me. It was disassociated from any of the user data in order to be compliant with privacy and so on.
And that might be all we've got time for. I think Will is just going to pop a link in the chat now. He knew his job right on cue. That's the report that's just gone live on our site. I will send you guys a follow-up email with a recording of this, Steph's slides, a link to this report, and also a link to Steph's analysis. So she's done even more analysis on a blog post, concluding in some sort of tips on how you can use that to benchmark your own data. So I hope you found this all as interesting and exciting as we have. And yeah, we'll be carry on adding more to this in the next few weeks. So I think that's it for us today.